Okay, so the last thing that we just said was really quite important, that this DNA is going to work in other living things, because that's the way that viruses work, and that's the way that viruses cause illness. If we go back to our page over here, after this, after the DNA is injected into the cell over here, you can see that the DNA gets incorporated. The viral DNA, I have it in red here, gets incorporated into your cell's DNA. So here's your cell, and here's your cell's DNA. Okay, and what this essentially does is the virus DNA hijacks your cell. So your cell no longer works as it typically would if it was I don't know, a lung cell, or what a respiratory cell, or I don't know, same thing I guess. Whatever type of cell it is, it no longer continues to work in its proper way. Instead, this little piece of DNA from the virus hijacks it, and what it starts to do is it starts to make extra copies of this virus. So you can see over here, these are all little viruses, right? And your cell is going to make hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of little copies of these viruses. Eventually, your cell is going to get so full of these viruses that it's going to burst open. Okay, and it bursts open and it releases all these viruses, which then go back and do this same exact thing. They're going to go stick to more viruses. To more cells, more of your cells, and they're going to then inject their DNA, hijack more cells, and cause more and more and more infection. And then this proliferates, and this is the reason that viral infection is then takes off. Okay, this is also the reason why this causes infection, where the infection is coming from. Your cells no longer work, and your cells also die. So your cells have jobs in your body, and when they're dead, they're no longer doing those jobs, which is really quite important to understanding how and why viruses work. So the next question brings us back to our last page over here, and looking at the coronavirus versus the COVID-19 virus. Well, how did this thing change, right? And where did this new virus come from? And we saw in the text chain, that, and this is a common conspiracy theory that, it's the government, right? It's the government released this new virus, or there's other conspiracy theories that China released this virus on its own people. But what evidence do we have for those claims? And I like to say that extraordinary claims need extraordinary evidence. And in times when we have a situation like this, we, instead of making up claims, we have to look for the most probable the most probable solution. So is there a more probable solution than it was either biological warfare or the government's releasing it on its own people for population control? Is there a plausible explanation that we would see in nature that could happen quite readily? And the answer is yes, it's evolution. Okay, and we see this all the time, everywhere, and so that's important to understand. All right, so instead of looking for these strange and unusual reasons for this, we have to have a good understanding of science and how things work in nature, and I think that's quite important. So how did this thing evolve, and where did it come from? And I saw in the text chain a couple times people mention mutations. So let's look at what a mutation actually is and how that happens. Okay, so over here, you guys probably remember at least a little bit about DNA. I don't know, maybe you watch CSI, or maybe you remember stuff from high school biology class. I don't know, maybe you do, maybe you don't. But some things that you might know about DNA, you might recognize the double helix shape, right? But if we unwind this and look at the actual structure, okay, we have the DNA is written in a code. It's a series of letters. These letters are essentially chemicals. They're letters to us. We gave them names so that we could identify them and try to understand the code. Okay, but you can see over here that this is a double strand, one strand on the bottom, another strand up top. And the DNA, this code, is written and it's paired. It's got a matching partner. So the top part, it has a corresponding bottom part. So up top, the chemical adenine, or we give it the symbol A, matches with a thymine. And over here, this thymine matches with an adenine, a thymine, and then we have these two other chemicals, G's and C's, that always pair up as well. And that's really quite important because the DNA in every single organism on the planet, there's one common ancestor for living things, and the DNA for all the planet, it's got the same exact machinery, which means that the DNA in the virus will work in the DNA of the cell. And that's why these viruses are able to hijack your cells. In addition to that, though, what we need to know about the DNA is that DNA, this code, has these little segments, and each segment is responsible for a trait. We call that a gene. I'm sure you've heard that term before, right? So a gene, that's a little short segment that codes for a trait. Now, if we're looking over here, there's obviously some differences in the traits, right? But these differences are caused by little miniature changes in the genetic code. Okay, so how does that happen? Okay, well, every single time your cells need to copy themselves, which is quite often, right? So today you're going to make around 100 million cells. So you need to make 100 million new copies of your DNA. And your DNA is quite lengthy. So from start to finish, there's about 3.5 billion letters. Okay, and so I obviously shortened it here because I don't want to be writing for my whole life. But to shorten it and to look at the process, every single time your cells are copied, you need to copy your DNA. And the way that happens is by this little special enzyme here. There's a whole big process here, but one of the most important guys here is this enzyme called polymerase. And polymerase reads this code, and it, based on the corresponding letter, it pulls these things that you ate from, the chicken and whatever else that you ate. You get these other letters, they're floating around in your body, and you pull them and you match up this code. So as this thing moves along and reads it, it's sticking in the corresponding letter. Well, you can see that down here is the same thing happened, okay, and I kind of simplified the process. And what we should wind up with, two identical copies. We should wind up with a double strand here and a double strand here, and these guys are identical. Okay, and you can see what happened though is that there was a mistake that was made. So as this thing was moving along, it put in a wrong letter. Now, a lot of times this DNA polymerase has the ability to go back and proofread, but even when it proofreads, imagine you writing a Word document. Even when you proofread, even using Microsoft Word editor, you still sometimes make mistakes. That's exactly what happens here. So when there's a mistake that's made in the code, that changes a trait. Sometimes the trait leads to death, okay? Because almost always, when the code is changed, it changes the structure, which is not good for the organism, okay? But every now and then, what happens is this code is changed, so it provides an advantage. So here is our original virus, our original coronavirus over here. Right, you notice that this original protein coat, this structure on the outside, it's very, very specific to the type of organism that it can infect. So this coronavirus over here, the original one that we find maybe in bats or in pangolins or in other examples of animals, it is not able to infect humans because this little structure over here can't stick to human cells. But now all of a sudden we made a mutation. Now all of a sudden the code is changed, and just by chance this thing was able to now stick and survive in human cells. Now most of the time this doesn't provide any advantage at all, because most of the time this thing doesn't come in contact with human cells. So if this were in a bat, this would have meant death to this virus, or another. I guess they can't die because they're not alive, but this would have meant that this virus could not be copied anymore, and would have ended its reign. All right, we're going to stop there because I got one more video.